Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Mejorado NYX Natural Yeast Inoculation Processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And they've been our most featured coffee roaster on this channel this year, as they've offered a number of very interesting coffees, including this one right here, as this is an experimental processed Mejorado coffee. And given that I've been a really big fan of the Mejorado coffees over the last couple of years, it felt like a great opportunity to branch out and try something a little bit more experimental. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this one was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So it's definitely a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to something this processed, though this coffee is still on the lighter side of things, though I wouldn't necessarily say it's the lightest version of a coffee we've had from them. So even then, I would still say on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup is a lot of what was expected with plenty of the IPA-like hoppiness though it was relatively toned down compared to some of the expectations that we'd had going into it. So when I did see 2 hops notes listed on this coffee, I think it's in terms of the flavor and maybe in terms of the aftertaste, then I said, okay, we're probably going to be dealing with a very IPA-like coffee, and that was certainly the case, as there was an additional bit of depth to it with some slight berry tartness in a lemon drop sense, and in addition to that, the coffee just had a very well-defined intensity to it in terms of that IPA-like hoppiness. So a lot of those things expected, though, as mentioned, slightly toned down relative to some of those expectations, but that's going to change here going forward, as on day 17, we ran it through the Chemex, and the cup now offers a very wild level of intensity. Still a little bit more toned down than maybe some of the expectations, as it's cleaner relative to a lot of coffees that have similar characteristics to it, that of course being that very heavy hoppy sort of IPA-like component. In addition to that, the most notable and long-lasting aspect of the entire cup continues to remain that very strong hoppiness to it, with a slight contrasting tartness as it continues to remain very intense. We continue to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and it continues to offer a very strong hops base with plenty of the citric and even tropical attributes to kind of complement it. There's a little bit more of the listed berry aspects, as the entire cup still continues to feel slightly toned down. This one was slightly toned down relative to those first 2 days. But we continue on to day 23 as we opted for the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the cup honestly felt like a beer jello, and I think that's the best way I can describe it, mostly because it had a very strong sweetness to it. But in addition to that, it continued to still offer that very intense hops-like IPA aspect of this coffee. Strong, sugary, sweet intensity to the cup to go alongside the hops. In addition to that, there is much more brightness with an abundance of the berry tartness as well. So this coffee is now starting to lean into a lot of the intense components of it. As on day 26, we opted for the Chemex, and the cup has been pretty consistent, as a lot of the notes we're going to discuss in this coffee are consistent, mostly because of just how intense and I will just say strong a lot of the aspects in this one were. There is a IPA-like tartness once again, though the booziness isn't necessarily something that I'm feeling too strong. I've mentioned this with some of the coffees in the past, and some of Coffea Circulor's coffees in the past as well, that while it has that very sort of beer-like intensity to it, it just has the flavor as opposed to maybe some of the boozy aspects that go alongside of it. That's the case with this coffee as well, as it's very bright with a strong citric intensity as well. A little change with any of the adjustments we've made so far. Continue on to day 29, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it is still present in a very intense sense with a huge abundance of the listed hops ever present. There's a slight bit more depth as it's offering a slight bit of citric components as well as some subtle stone fruits, but it's all buried behind that very strong and intense hopsy IPA-like flavor profile to this one. It is slightly improved on this day, where the entire cup is going to be very intense still. Day 32, through the Chemex, and it was actually the best that had been up to this point, and that's why I opted for this one as our preferred brew method. This one was brewed with our standard recipe. It continues to lean heavily into the strong citric hops IPA direction with a surprisingly nice level of definition. As that's one of the better things I do have to say about this coffee is the flavor profiles in this one extremely well defined. Like, you're able to pull out that note specifically, as well as some of the other tart berry aspects to this one pretty well. They're just very well defined, pretty well articulated, as there's a slight candied feel to this cup as well. All of the flavor profiles in this one very intense, pronounced, and just defined. Earthy as well. A lot of attributes in this one. We continue on to day 35. Our final notes, one more try through the Chemex, and there's been a little change in terms of toning down this coffee as it continues to offer that very strong citric, hopsy, and tart berry aspect to it. It has been pretty consistent in that sense, as there hasn't been much else that we've been able to get aside from those very strong characteristics, in addition to some very subtle components to it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 5 level 5s. That actually might be a record. So let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 5. I don't think that's surprising whatsoever. This is another one of those coffees that as soon as I took that first sip, I knew I was going to be tasting this one for an extended period of time. And that is certainly the case, as it leaves that very lingering, lasting IPA sort of hopsy component to it. And then in addition to that, we have the sweetness there at that level 5. And this one is kind of interesting, given that it skews so heavily in that specific direction. It is a little interesting to think that the sweetness is still extremely high, as a lot of the attributes in this one wouldn't necessarily lend itself towards being an extremely sweet coffee. But this one, I think maybe that's the little bit of Mejorado at play, as this one was insanely sweet right from the onset. And it kind of came in a slightly candied sense and a slightly jello-like sense. And for that reason, there's a lot of sugary aspects to it. And it scored a level 5 in terms of the sweetness, as this is an extremely sweet coffee. Continue on to the spice, level 5. And that one I feel like is kind of that herbal spice-like quality, that IPA beer-like attribute that's present within this one. That and the savoriness, I'm just going to talk about those two side by side. That's what scored them both at that level 5 mark, mostly because they're just so strong, and that's the best place I could put both of those components, as it does have a spiced feel to it and does have a slightly savory in terms of that very herbal feel to it. So both those things scoring very high at that level 5. Citrus fruit, level 5. I once again put the citric hops component of this one right there. There is a little bit of that lemon, as I mentioned on some of the earlier days, but for the most part, it just skews very heavily in terms of that citric hops direction. Those 3 things all go together, and they are extremely strong and pronounced. Actually, all 5 of those things go together, as those, as well as the finish and the sweetness, all kind of go in that same sense. Just a very intense coffee. Continue on to a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. That one I feel like is going to be a very interesting spot for this coffee, as it doesn't necessarily sound like it's an overly clean coffee. And I said to myself, like I've said in the past, the definition in this one is great. I'm not necessarily getting any sort of funkiness or fermentiness. It just weirdly tastes the way it does, and it just so happens to taste like beer without the booziness to it. And given that the flavor profiles in this one are extremely well defined, I feel like the best place to put the clarity is at that level 4, even if in theory it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's just kind of where the cleanliness for this one finished. Acidity level 4, there's a surprisingly high level of brightness to this one. As I've mentioned in the past, Coffea Circular's coffees don't necessarily tend to be the brightest coffees. This one, on the other hand, offered plenty of brightness to it in terms of that citric sense once again. So that scores pretty high at that level 4 mark. Saltiness, level 4. I don't think there are a lot of coffees we've scored very high in terms of the saltiness, at least that level 4 mark. This one, on the other hand, when making this tasting wheel, I said this is a pretty salty coffee as well. So it's also offering that to kind of contrast a lot of those stronger characteristics to it. Berry fruit, level 4, maybe the secondary most pronounced characteristic hidden behind all of those really bright citric hops components, as that one continued to remain in that more tart berry sense. So even then, it was one of those things that went alongside of that beer-like attribute of this one. Bitterness, level 4. This had a fair bit of bitterness, and of course, I think that's going to be that slight beer-like bitterness to it. This is kind of an interesting topic. As somebody that doesn't really drink, I don't think I've had an IPA in quite a while. I've noticed that those coffees for me tend to taste bitter, but a lot of people have said that beer or IPA specifically aren't overly bitter, but for whatever reason, this one tasted that way to me. So very bitter coffee in that sense. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll speed run through those. Florality, level 3. I think it's a little bit more of a generic florality when I was making this tasting wheel, saying, yeah, there's a floral sense to it hidden beneath all of these very intense components. Caramel level 3, I've touched on that briefly as there's a very slight candied aspect to this one that I wanted to demonstrate here in this tasting wheel. And then the last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 3. As for all of the things I've discussed, something a little bit more normal for this coffee is that it was a little bit more medium bodied, and that's one of the few normal aspects of this coffee that's worth discussing. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've actually said this in the past when it comes to other Mejorado coffees. I definitely don't feel that processing is needed for this varietal specifically. I understand why it's done for a lot of other ones, but this one right here already offers enough sweetness and intensity that processing it just maybe takes it a little too far, as that's the case with this coffee. It's pretty well known and documented at this point. I'm not a big fan of beer in general, and even less so when coffees end up tasting that way. I don't like any sort of booziness or fermentiness, funkiness within my coffee. So for that reason, it's not too surprising that I didn't end up liking this coffee as much as maybe on paper I could have. It sounded like an interesting concept, but then when I actually tried this coffee, I said, yeah, this one's definitely not for me, and it became a very tricky coffee to drink and to take notes on, mostly because the intensity was so strong and I was only able to get those kind of first couple of aspects and components in this one and kind of write those down, and anything else that was present within it took a lot more work to kind of dig up and pick up from this coffee. So this one, unsurprisingly, not necessarily my thing. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to if you really do enjoy your beer-like coffees, especially if you like your IPAs, then this one right here is a perfect fit for you in that sense, as that offered such a very strong, intense IPA-like aspect to it. I think there is a group of people that like these sort of coffees, especially something that is offering something this specific, this defined, and this, we'll just say, unique. As I've had some coffees like this, I think this is maybe one of the better representations of a coffee like this, but even then it's still maybe just a little bit too intense, a little too much for me. I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Mejorado NYX Natural Yeast Inoculation Processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.